I really hope people will get the introduction over here because that will be foundational. Just wait another moment. Okay, here we go. Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi, Kalayim, Pedig Beis, Halacha Dalid. We're learning today Daf Tez Zayin. We're starting on Daf Tez Zayin, Amidala, 4 lines from the top of the Amid by the new Mishnah. And the following words of introduction are very important, which is that from this Mishnah until the end, not of this Pedig, until the end of the 3rd Pedig, an hour Dafim until Daf Lamed Hey, all of the sugyas will be regarding various planting configurations. And I hope Kevin gets on over here because it will be very helpful to have pictures that will allow different crops to be planted in close proximity one to the other. In other words, the issue when it comes to kilei zeroyim is not that of them being yoinik, them drawing nourishment one from the other. It's not about that. It's from them not appearing to be mingled, right? We learned a couple of weeks ago that anything under, I think it was 3 tfachim under the ground, even if the roots mamish go one into the other, there is no issue of kilei zeroyim. Amazing, because it's very deep in the ground. Now, let's begin with the case of our Mishnah. Here we're speaking about a person, and we have to become familiar with these terms. There is something that's called a sadeh, a field. The definition of a field is an area that's called also a beis roiva. Guys, let's remember this. A beis roiva is an area of 10.2 ames by 10.2 ames. An area larger than a beis roiva is called a field. We're going to have later on the minimum amount of distance that you have to make between one sadeh and the other for a person not to be in violation of sadcha le'sizra koloim. However, if the area in which you are planting is not defined as a sadeh, because the area does not have more than the minimum of 10.2 times 10.2 ames, there will be 2 ways of defining the area. If it's lesser than the area of the sadeh, one will be called a meruba. A meruba means a square. All right. So even if it's a drop less than a beis roiva, meruba, that's also not the case of our Mishnah. The case of our Mishnah is called a meishar. Mem shin reish. Meishar means a strip. The definition of a strip is going to be a rectangular that has, as we'll see later, a minimum of 6 tfachim of width. It can be as long as the galus. It can be very long. That's called a meishar. Okay, 6 tfachim and very long, rectangular. Our Mishnah will discuss that if you have a meishar adjacent to another meishar, and you want to plant in each one different grains, different legumes, what is the space that's needed which will allow for a person to plant without violating the sadcha le'sizra koloim? You know, it's amazing. I think on Daf Aleph, we quoted the Targum Onkelos that the word kalayim means a mixture, taroivis. In other words, that's the whole point. Not about Yudika. As long as it's, let's use English, as long as it is noticeably distinct, you're good. So if the area is a sadeh, you need more empty space, or let's use the word gap. You need a larger gap for them to be halachically noticeably distinct. By a meishar, there's going to be a much shorter gap needed. The Mishnah will not speak in the terms of tvachim nor of ames. The Mishnah is going to use other means to communicate the minimum gap. And in the Gemara, today's daf, we're going to see that there's a machloikis between Rabbi Ruba and Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Now, Rabbi Chia cannot argue with Rabbi, right? Rabbi Chia is an Amoira. Rabbi is a Tana. But as we'll see, that there were other Tanoim that argued with Rabbi. The Havamina and the Maskana will be that there's only a two-way argument. The two-way argument will be regarding the shiurim of our Mishnah, whether the Mishnah is referring to the largest size gap or the smallest size gap. We'll explain that when we learn that inside. There is at one point a Havamina that there is a three-way machlokes, but we're going to conclude that there's two opinions only, and we're going to attribute them not to the Chachamim against Rebbe, but to Rabbi Chia Ruba, to the great Rabbi Chia, or Rabbi Chia Stam in the Bavli, and Rabbeinu HaKadosh, how to interpret the shiurim of our Mishnah. It's both about Amis and also, as we'll see, minimum and maximum gap. This is the entire daf. It's very easy, but guys, I think it's important for those who are coming. First of all, I think Kevan who's here, because having pictures will make all of the difference. Some things are technical that when you look at the picture, you'll chop it. Whoever doesn't have a picture will have to have a lot more yigia in imagining what's going on over here. And remember these words of introduction. So none of the shiurim that we are learning about will be applicable to when we're speaking about the separation of one field to the other, because we're dafka speaking about the meishar strip, which is much narrower than a sada, and therefore there's a much less gap needed for them to be noticeably distinct. Says the Holy Mishnah. You have 10.2 amas times 10.2 amma plus. You can have a field, a real field, many miles to the length, many miles to the width. See, it's not about how much land you own. It's how do you plan to plant it. It's if you're sowing it all together. Now, we all know that when you sow a field, you don't mingle things. You make furrows. We know that. But if it's planted like a field, that's not the case of the Mishnah. This guy is saying, I have a big chunk of land, a million times base raivas. It doesn't matter how big it is. But the way I'm going to plant it is by planting 6 tvachim wide, all the way from one end to the other. I want to know what is the minimum gap I need to leave for me to plant another narrow strip called a meishar. He's not planting it all together. He's dividing his field into meishars, which you are allowed to do. That will allow you to plant many more different types of species in that same area of land. Question is, again, how much space is needed? Machlokes Beishamai Beisilo. Beishamai oimrim shloisha tolamim shel posiach. Again, we'll see in the Gemara what this means in Amos. But Beishamai and Beisilin in our Mishnah are using physical instruments that farmers in the times of Chazal were familiar with. So we learned a couple of daf ago of the type of furrows that one made, Talmud Revia. Now we're learning about another type of furrow. In other words, when a person is plowing for the first time in the season, right? So then they make furrows, right? They make the first charisha. The width of 3 such furrows is the amount needed to separate between one meishar and the other. Again, what that means in Amos, we'll see. Beisilol holds, they'll be more lenient, a little bit more lenient, that in the area on the Holy Land called Shannon, they used to have a unique type of yoke, a unique type of oil. And as we'll see in the Gemara, that this shear is only of 2 ames, but instead of Isil saying 2 ames, they use that instrument, which had a standard size of 2 ames, that it has to have this width between one meishar and the other has to actually be the length of this type of yoke. I know that he says over here, the width I'm reading in the Rashi Elio, middle of the right column, oil hanimtza b'makom sheshmoi sharon shechoshim by karmeim shekarev arkoi l'shtei ames, again approximate a little almost 2 ames. That's the shear that's needed to separate between one nation and the other. Being that neither Beishamai here or Beisilo gave their shiurim in ames and tvachim, so the Mishnah now concludes that I want you to know. The Mishnah is saying this. Rabbeinu HaKadosh is saying it. That there is a very little difference between the opinions of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. I want you to know that Beis Shammai's shiur of the 3 shloisha tolamim shel posiach, the groundbreaking furrows, 3 widths is a little bit larger than the shear of Beis Hillel. And just to remember, guys, that larger means he demands a greater gap, which means Beis Shammai, as normally is, he's more machmer than Beis Hillel. But we're speaking about approximately 2 amas that we already got from the Rashid Elio, and also to know that the difference between one and the other is very minimal. Okay, now let's begin. Says the Gemara.
The 2 amos is Beis Shammai?
I'm sorry?
The 2 amos is Beis Shammai, Rabbi? 2 amos is the measurement for Beis Shammai?
I cannot give you an answer. I'll tell you why. Because the Rashid Elio says the words Koroiv, right? Shekoriv orkoi l'shtei amos. The Gemara is going to speak about 2 amos. We'll see in a moment, no doubt.
But then it's below. If it's Karov, it's below.
Paskin like Beis Hillel. So either the Gemara shtei amos is inaccurate, or in other words, Beis Shammai says a little bit less than 2 amos. Beis Hillel says, I'm sorry, a little bit less than 2 amos. That's what the Rashid Elio says. Beis Shammai says 2 amos, and the Gemara is going to speak about 2 amos.
Thank you.
Okay, now let's go. Now, Kevin, if you can put up the pictures that you have on the screen, that will be mamish important. When you learn the Mishnah, I'm going to say the whole daf by heart. When you learn the Mishnah, the understanding is, again, exactly who says what. We're going to just to round off that picture. We need the other. That's it. That's the picture you should leave up. That we're going to speak about 2 amos. When you learn the Mishnah, it sounds like you have to have a gap of 2 amos separating the entirety of the Meishar of the right to the Meishar to the left. And if you want to plant your field into 100 Meisharim, okay, so between each one, you have to have 2 amos. What the Gemara is going to make clear is that 2 amos is not a gap that's needed throughout the entire separation of strip number 1, Meishar number 1, and Meishar number 2. The only question will be, like we mentioned in the words of introduction, and we're going to begin with the Shita of Rabbi Ruba, that understands that the shiurim of Beis Shammai / Beis Hillel, which will say 2 amos, which might not be exact, just approximation, is the max that's needed. The Mishnah is speaking about the largest area where you have to put the gap, but you don't need to have that gap throughout the whole separation of strip 1, strip 2. You can taper off to smaller, as we'll see in a moment, and we're going to have an Aftazayin Amud Bey, Shitas Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Don't put that out there; that's not helpful. And we're going to learn Shitas Rabbeinu HaKadosh that says no, that you have to have a much larger gap. 2 amos is the smallest amount that you can have, as we'll see. One thing is clear, that this shear, I'm going to just refer to 2 amos because the Gemara is going to refer to 2 amos. So we're not even going into Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, is not consistent. It does not have to be throughout all of the separation of strip number 1 and strip number 2. Now let's read this inside. Rav Ze'edam, in the name of Rabbi Lazar, here we go. It all comes b'shem Rabbi Chia Ruba. In Bavli, Rabbi Chia Stam in the Yerushalmi becomes the great Rabbi Chia. He says that how much of the area between these 2 strips have to have a width of 2 amos? Only 2 amos length. Only 2 amos length. Oise shtei amos al shtei amos. That's it. Now it doesn't make a difference, Chevra, if, let's say, you see the picture that you have is a little bit deficient, but that's fine. All right, he's putting the strips going over here. Whoever's looking at the picture, it's going horizontally. He's not showing you the length of the strip. Yeah. We're up to the Gemara. And it doesn't matter whether you put this gap of 2 amos length by 2 amos width, which the Mishnah is speaking about the width, at the beginning of the strips, whether you put it in the middle, whether you put it at the end. Where do you have to have a gap at the size of 2 by 2? Only in one area. What about for the remaining area? You can minimize it and minimize it and minimize it and minimize it. So you're going to reform the shape of, let's say, of a triangular, right? Because each side is going to start taking up more space. Each strip you will allow each strip to widen, and all you will need that to separate one strip and the other is a mashahu, which is amazing. And why is that enough? Again, because the concern by Kilei Zerayim is never about Yanika. The concern is only about, it should not appear to be mingled. It has to look like it is distinct. And whenever you have in any place between the two strips, a gap of 2 amas wide, and it's going for 2 amas in the length, no matter where you put it, as long as the remaining of the strip don't touch, it can go within a hairbreadth of each other. It's not mingled. It looks distinct. It's not called kalayim. Let's read it inside. That all you need, how much time? Like Bishamim will speak about around 2 amas. Don't think you need to have 2 amas throughout the entire separation of one strip and the other. No, you only have to have the area of 2 amas of length that has this 2 amas of width. And what about the rest? In other words, then you can use more land for a plantation, which is what a farmer wants. So a farmer wants to use as much land as he could. You're going to do it consistently. That means each strip will go in, will start eating up more and more. So you're going to taper off. And as long as there is a kol shuhu of space, a quarter of a finger width, so when you look at it, you see they don't touch, they're not touching, then you're good. Now,
is that the last picture?
I'm sorry?
Is that the last picture?
No, we have many pictures today. One picture will be important. This picture was easy. So far, let's go by it. By the way, this is rule number 1. This is the rule B'Shem Rabbi Yeruba. The Gemara is going to give you another rule. This is important. B'Shem Rabbi Yoina. The rule B'Shem Rabbi Yoina, we're not going to debate. We're going to come back. We're going to see that Rabbeinu HaKadosh doesn't agree with Rabbi Yeruba. Rabbi Yeruba cannot argue with him, but as we'll see in Amud Beis, there are other Tanoim that Rabbi is leaning on. Rule number 2, this is the opening shot of this entire sugya. Chavra Daf Tezayin, Amud Aleph, right, 5 or 6 lines before the bottom of the Amud. Amar Rabbi Yoinam, Hadod de Tamar. This is a Gavaldic leniency. This leniency of our Mishnah is only, like we spoke out on the Mishnah, Ba'asuya Meisharim. Only, right? Only if you don't have an area that is halachically defined as a sada. You don't have it. You have an area that's smaller than a sada. The definition of a sada is an area larger than a beis raiva, which would mean an area that's 10 by 2 amas, times a little bit more than 10 by 2 amas. That's called a field. Our Mishnah is dafka not one area that has that size in which you're planting. Only, yes, strips. Avol basuya meishod echad. But if you have a sada again, defined, you have a 10.2 times a little bit more than 10.2, or a lot more, a field. And now I want to plant a meishod next to a field. Loy beda. We are not allowed to have this leniency. Look inside, very important. The Pnei Moshe, very important. The Pnei Moshe is the first widest line. The first widest line. Avol basuya meishod echad. Then we don't have this kula. Claim. She'im ein hasada asuya arugos l'chol min v'min. If you didn't break up your field, transforming it into strips, how would you do that? Again, even though we're not going to read this today, but a strip is an area that only has 6 tfachim of width, and that's our Mishnah. So you made 6 tfachim width. You have a 2 amma gap. Really, you don't even need 2 ammas the whole strip. But in one area, you have 2 ammas. Another strip, then gegezum tehait as much as you want. But if you didn't do that, Ella says the Pnei Moshe was still in the first line, in the first widest line. He kamoi aruga achas. If you made one patch. The Einam of Delis Lakamarugais. Now, even though the Pnei Moshe is not telling you it, I'm telling you it. The one patch is defined as a sada when it has. It's not about it being a square. That's called a meruba. It's because it has the halachic definition of a field more than a beis raiva, 10.2 amas times a bit more. So you have that. And
six
that's the width of a meishar. And so you have a field and you own the land. And now you want to plant adjacent to your field, you want to plant a meshar. You want to plant a strip. But it's not a strip near a strip, it's a strip near a sudden. The year it's a lizroya ba shnei minim. You want to plant a strip. Now, if you want to plant that strip with the same type, why make it a strip? And there's no problem. But the point is, you want to plant it from another species. And then you're going to say, aha, I know the Mishnah. I'm planting a Mesha. The Mishnah gave me a shear. Shear is of 2 amas. Before we go back to the way Rabbi Ruba Mamash should minimize that shear, but let's just be the shear of 2 amas. No, says Rabbi Yoina, don't think you can do that. Why? Mishum that kishe'ein hasada nides ela karuga achas. Once there is one of the 2 areas that do not look like a strip, they look like a field. Also, lizroya ba shnei minim. You can't have in one sada 2 different types. By only using this minimum gap, which is of around 2 amas. What is the gap needed? Beis Roiva is 10.2 amas by 10 by 2 amas. And that's actually going to be a Mishnah that we'll have later. Okay, that tvua b'tvua. Tvua b'tvua means a field of grain, even though the Mishnah doesn't use the word sada, but that's what it means. And you want to plant adjacent to it another field of grain, the space is not 2 amas. Yes, Beis Roiva. The imkain, I'm finishing the Pnei Moshe. You don't have none of that leniency applies over there. Okay. So these are the 2 rules. And now the second rule of Rabbi Yoina is going to be qualified a lot today. It's not as bad as it sounds, but we're beginning with the Yesoidis. And whoever's coming on late, just they say that later, if you're not going to miss something because you missed the words of introduction, and you won't get this. And this is important today because this goes from now until Daf Lamed Hey. It's very easy. You just have to have the rules. So again, the leniency of the smallness of the gap, which the Mishnah says is 2 amas. Rabbi Ruba says, 2 amas, only by 2 amas of length. It's only a 2 by 2 amas. And the rest, a mashahu of space, that's between Meshar and Meshar. Says Rabbi Yina, if you have a sada planted and you want to plant near it, even only a Meshar, then you're bound by the laws of Ben Sada L'Sada. What's the law Ben Sada L'Sada? Beis Roiva. Beis Roiva is 10.2 amas by 10 by 2 amas. Okay. Another detail, which is clear from the Pnei Moshe that many people argue with. Between a Sada L'Sada, can we rely on the heter of Rabbi Ruba by saying that Ben Sada L'Sada, Beis Roiva, only 10.2 times 10.2, but then it can taper off, and the remaining separation, Ben Sada L'Sada, could be less. The Pnei Moshe is writing explicitly not. The last, again, I'm going to read again the last few words of the Pnei Moshe. The heter of Meitzar B'Hoilach is Rabbi Ruba said that even though the Mishnah gives a shear, the Gemara is saying the shear doesn't mean the whole length need that amount of gap. No, you don't need that. We don't say that leniency being Sada L'Sada. So really, we learned in Rabbi Yoina 2 dinim. The emphasis that our Mishnah is only being Meshar or Meshar, and number 2, that when we're going to learn later the shear, the larger gap needed being Sada L'Sada, that larger shear cannot taper off. That larger shear is the ganze separation between field A and field B. All of it has to have 10.2 amas of a separation. Now let's go back in the Gemara. And now the Gemara is not going to be referring to Rabbi Yoina. Now we're going back to Rabbi Ruba. Says the Gemara, I want you to know that Rabbi Ruba gave a gavaldik kula, right? The Mishnah said you need a shear, and Rabbi Ruba says, the shear is only needed for 2 amas. You don't need it for more than 2 amas. Well, actually, is good. He's not alone, Rabbi Ruba. That we know from a statement that Rabbi Yanai said that the shear of 2 amas in our Mishnah is only for 2 amas. Guys, you have to be a farmer to appreciate this. Says the what did Rabbi Yanai say? That Yochil Ana Zora Chakli Chamshin Minin. I'm able to plant, right? Chakal Tapuchim Kadishin, guys. We know these words. It means a field. I'm able to plant in my field, 50 different, 50 guys, 50 different minim, without violating kilei zeroim, as long as my field is 25 amas by 25 amas. And how will he do it? I'm sorry, my field has to be 50 amas by 50 amas. And here we need to have the picture came on. If the field is 50 by 50, listen to this. He can plant in that field 50. Guys, Lalunde Rambam, the Rambam never gave this case. Esrim, and how will he get 50? No. Esrim v'chamshin mikan, v'esrim v'chamisha mikan. 25 on this side and 25 in that side. And the only way you can squeeze it in with all the measurements is only predicated on the leniency of Rabbi Yeruba that demands that's how they did it. Only a 2 amas. So guys, take a look at the picture. Make the picture bigger. Okay, if you can't see it over here, then you have to have an art scroll. Whoever's using an art scroll, we're going to page 16A3. You have to see that. Look in the bottom. First of all, see the field. And I want everyone to notice something that we are learning and something that we're not, if you don't remember a din that we learned last week from tomorrow's daf, you're going to get stuck. I know, did he have uvda? So let me tell you what's going on over here. Look at this field. The middle, mamash in the middle, the Mishnah, you see, first of all, you're planting strips. In every strip, you're planting another type. But one thing is important, Chavre, whoever can see the picture, right? The strips are going in the horizontal. You're not planting on one strip only one type. You're planting on every strip, on the right side, one min, and on the left side, another min. Whether the person who made the picture did it perfect or not, or whether it came out on print perfect, when it comes to the top one and the one underneath it and the one underneath it, there always has to be a minimal gap. The chiddush of our Gemara is that the 2 amas with gap is only needed for 2 amas. So what you end up doing is you end up benefiting. You're using a lot more land than you would have thought otherwise. You get it? Because you can taper off. You're not focusing in the right place. I don't have to look at those small measurements, but I just want to emphasize whoever's looking at this picture, if you're going from top to bottom between every strip, there has to be always a minimum gap between one and the other.
So all the white space is just
between
empty,
one from
Rabbi?
going from top to bottom.
Rabbi, all the white space on this picture is empty.
What was that?
Is all the white
Yeah,
space.
all the white spaces are empty.
So every row has empty space. It's just as it tapers to the end, it gets filled in. Got it.
You get less and less of a gap. In other words, the 2 amas with gap. The 2 amas with gap is when you're going Milmaila Lamata in the picture, is only needed for 2 amas. Only 2 amas in the width. But here's something that I want to just give words. There's a problem. If you don't have this information, you're going to have a question on this. You know what the question is? How was Rabbi Yanai allowed to plant on every row 2 types to the right and to the left when the horizontal lines are mamish touching each other? There isn't any gap in between the right and the left. How was that allowed? So we already quoted a few weeks ago from a Mishnah we're going to learn tomorrow called Rosh Tor. Rosh Tor means is that if you have a 2 fields, right, 2 areas of plantations, and they're not planted in the same direction, if they are obviously coming in an angle, one to the other, so an observer sees that they were not planted side by side. In other words, when you compare in the picture the top row to the row underneath it to the row underneath it, there's a consistency. They're aligned. When you go, just look at every row by itself, and you look the right part of the row, it tapers off into a point. The left side of a row tapers off into a point. These 2 points, which is called a Rosh Tor, are allowed to even touch each other. When do you have to have a separation? They meishar lameishar. Because if you're looking at the rows, you're going from Milmaila, Lamato, 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 they are all the same form. So here's where you have to have epis of separation. The Mishnah said 2 amas. Yeah, 2 amas only in for 2 amas. Put that in the middle, and you're going to benefit the most space over here. But on every row itself, we're not talking about this yet, but I just want you to see the pictures, meduyak, that they can even touch. Bottom line is that Rabbi Yanai would plant his fields the way we have in the picture, and that's because Rabbi Yanai agrees with Rabbi Chiyaruba, not contradicting the Mishnah, God forbid, is that the shiurim of the Mishnah is only for 2 amas length, and not more than that. Okay.
And just to be clear, Rabbi, he's able to get that many different species in that field because the top and the bottom is a half size. That's how he got it in the 25. So
then the art scroll made the actual cheshbon, and he realized that there's something else you have to squeeze in, and that is, in order to squeeze it in, the top and the bottom row, thank you for reminding me, doesn't have the regular 2 a bit, but it has only 1 and a bit. It's not a wooden fit. All of that, okay, very good. Thank you. That's a good point for people who don't see the picture. Okay. You see that in the Gemara. You don't see any of that in the Gemara. Everything, the whole Yerushalmi is based on people knowing a lot before learning the Gemara. Okay, now, says the Gemara, listen guys, halt kop, af b'shtei sadois. This is important, these gersois came. In other words, that like Rabbi Yoinam, who emphasized that the leniency of this small gap is only between Meishar LaMeishar, not between a Sada and a Sada. Af b'shtei Sadas Kains means that if you turn your fields into Meishars, only then can you have this lenient little gap of 2 amas, which is even further limited by the Gemara, the 2 amas by 2. Masha'en Kain, even though he says b'shtei Sadas, I want you to know, he doesn't mean shtei sadas that were not made into strips. All these words. Shtei sadas, look inside the Marafulda, after shtei sadas, before you turn the Amid, after shtei sadas came, hecha, shtei sadas shel ish echad. But only if, va'asoyim shtei meisharim, namidinehach. But since you transform both fields into strips, that's where you can do what we just said. And what's the shir we already learned before in the Pnei Moshe? If you have what's defined as a sada between field and field, the minimum amount needed is base roiva. You don't need that. The dainin and hakoil, the last line in the Amid, can make sharim. Ubatel mehem shem sadois. And the gavaldikite is, if you don't have the halachic terminology of a sada, yes, only meishar, the chi'ika hefsek only 2 amas, then it becomes mutter. Now let's go weiter. We're not done yet. Next step. Top of daf tezayin with base. Meyatom. Let's go weiter based on what we learned above. Afinu beinu lebein chaveiroi mutter. What case are we talking about over here? Take some time to chop over here. That what? Let me remember the case over here. Look inside the marafuld on the top. Sheyesh sada lechaveiroi shesmucha lezu va'asuya meisharim. Ain't tzarich lahafsik v'neim ela beizames. Ve'ilu loy nasis meisharim kaimelon da asur lezroi b'neim min acher. Avali asuya meisharim muter b'hafsaka hazois. Afilu nizra min achar beinayim, because dainin and akola misharim kshem shebatlu menu shem sada min asada hachinami hay min achar nechshav lemeisharim. Here now we're moving not before we had 2 fields that belong to the same person. Now we're learning about, very good. Now we're learning about 2 different people. 2 people own different pieces of land. That if Reuven planted his entire field as Mesharim, we don't say that since Shimon owns the other land. So now that the ownership will make them considered 2 separate fields. Then you'll have to have the larger gap. No, we don't say that. Doesn't make a difference. That's the afilu bein lebein chaveroi. That's it. Even if it belongs to two different people, if Reuven chose to plant his fields as strips, so batal shem sada, strips. Shimon has to plant strips. Very good. And now you only have to have that shear, but now we're going to go further. Now the Gemara says, af b'chur b'kei. This is big. Oh, took me a while. What's af b'chur b'kei? Look inside the mud. Let's go back to the mud. I'll fold the 7 lines from the top. That heichad the sada asuim meisharim. All right, so the Reuven's field was made into strips. Shimon's ve'idach sada, the other guy, Shimon's field, she'etzla, nechrava, he had planted, listen to this, David. Shimon had a field, Reuven planted wheat. Strips, it's important, strips. He didn't plant it. Or the closest to Shimon is wheat. Reuven is good. Shimon planted his field without leaving the base roiv agat. Made a mistake. And he planted it of barley. And there the halacha would be just to know that if you plant things within the space where you're not allowed to, really, you know what you need to do? You have to uproot it. Before anyone uprooted Shimon's field got destroyed. The big barley plantation got destroyed with locusts. What remained from Shimon was halachically a strip. So now that it's now a strip, you can leave it the way it is. That's the final statement. That heichad the sada asuya meisharim. Reuven's field was made into meisharim. The idach sada she'etzla, Shimon's field next to it, that was planted illegally, halachically illegally, which would have demanded you to uproot it by itself. Nechrava got destroyed. Only a little bit of Shimon's field remained, and what part remained was smuchim heim zu. How close are they? You only have the 3 tulamim beineim. I want to speak to Yakir. The fact that the Marafulda, I understand, says 3 tulamim, and I think because he understands that when the Gemara says 2 amas is Beishamai's share. That's what Yakir was asking. It's funny that the Gemara is using Beishamai's share, but then it doesn't matter. So we say Chashvina lo oisema at nami meishin masada hazu. Now that it got destroyed. No, otherwise, if it wouldn't have gotten destroyed, you would have to uproot it. And how far? Uproot how much? You would have to uproot it from the border of Reuven, base Roiva. What happened is that Shimon's field by itself became diminished. Now you don't have the Sudden. Now you only have a Meshad in Shimon's field. Now that it's that way, we can say, Mikano Lahaba, you're good. Because since even by itself, Shimon's field turned only into a strip, Shebatal Mimenu Shem saw them. Beautiful. Now, says the Gemara.
So if you planted yours first and your neighbor then did it, there's nothing you need to do.
That's correct. And we're going to learn more about that later. Very good.
Is that a certain configuration or a configuration? Like you have those strips before.
So the Gemara is going to make a good point about the configuration. On this last case, when the Gemara says, based on the heter, that once halachically it's not called a sudden, even though it was planted not kosher, which normally would demand you uprooting it. Now that what remained is only a few tvachim width of Shimon. So now that it's called a meshar, we continue with the heter that this minimum gap is enough. Really, the Gemara says, oyeva. Even without it, there would be another reason why now that Shimon's field got destroyed by itself, natural disaster, and there is a remaining barley strip near the Reuven's, Shimon can leave it, you can base it on another heter. Oyeva, kai, like the Amar, Reish Lakish b'shem Chizkiyam, which is that Roish Toir Haba Mechurva Mutar. Again, the Roish Toir we're going to learn tomorrow. Daf Yud Zayin. Roish Toir is a corner of one field that protrudes into the other. Until now, on the picture that I mentioned, Danny, I just said that one touches the other, which is allowed. It's amazing. We're going to learn tomorrow that as long as when a person looks and he sees that these two fields are not planted in the same direction, it's coming in from an angle. It's different. It's a different plantation because it's angle different. Not only can they be adjacent, now not the whole field, just a protrusion. Even if one goes into the other, it's allowed. It's amazing. So says the Gemara, when you use the heter of the Mishnah, remember, the heter of the Mishnah is only okay, and according to Rabbi Ruba, for it to become very close. 2 amas, only for 2 amas. For the rest, there has to be a separation. However, the moment you use the other heter that we'll learn tomorrow of a Reish Tard, not only could they touch, one can go into the field of the other. So the reason why Shimon, in this case, when Shimon had a whole field, you have to have a separation. When Shimon had a field. But now that it got destroyed, okay, the presumption is it didn't get destroyed. It didn't allow the remaining part to be exactly the way Reuven's field is configured. It doesn't work that way. When there's a natural disaster, you look at it, you see Reuven's field is mesuded, like when you're airplane, you see beautiful. And Shimon's field is a field that's charuf. So that makes it distinct from Reuven's. And therefore, again, that Reish Tor Haba Mechurba, which is amazing, is also muter, which even though it was planted in a way where you didn't have the heter of a Reish Tor, but if later it got destroyed and it became a Reish Tor like we're going to learn tomorrow, so there's really, in the case, Af Bechurba came, there are 2 reasons why Shimon won't have to uproot his barley. Number 1 is because of what we're learning. Once you go from Sada to Meishar, even though Lechatchila you were bound by the laws of Sada, which would demand Beis Roiva separation. But now that it became a Meishar, now you only have to have the lesser separation. In addition to that, when a field gets destroyed, the destroyed field could be viewed as a Reish Tor. And a Reish Tor is even more lenient than what we're learning today. It can touch and it can go in.
Because of the way it got destroyed, or just the way that the field was?
Because of the way it got destroyed. Because when it got destroyed, it's not going to look like the same. Okay, don't take that picture away, Kevin. That doesn't help us. Okay, guys, we're going back to the beginning. Again, the big chiddush of Rabbi Ruba was, you learn a Mishnah, it's late. The Mishnah says you have to have a separation of, let's say, the words 2 amas. And no, it says Rabbi Ruba, no, not 2 amas, the whole separation. The gap only for 2 amas, 2 amas. Rabbi also says that the Mishnah's shear is not consistent throughout strip and strip, but he's much more machmir. Rabbi Omer, no, that what's a given is that the separation between one strip and the other has to be a Beis Roiva. 1 second, guys. Between a field and a field, you have a Beis Roiva. That's why we learned the Pnei Moshe. Yeah, between a field and a field, you have to have a Beis Roiva from one end to the other. The entire part of Reuven's field, even by the way, even if it belongs to the same person, field, you want to plant in different species, field defined by a certain size or more, there you have to have a Beis Roiva in Gansen. Our Mishnah is saying that if you have a Meishar, you have to begin with a Beis Roiva box, 10.2 times 10.2, and then you can limit the gap. But when you limit the gap, what will be the smallest part of the gap? 2 amas. Here, Rabbi Ruba says, no, 2 amas is the biggest part of the gap. Smallest part of the gap is mashu. Rabbi says, no, the biggest part of the gap, the Mishnah doesn't even have to say, you have to have a Beis Roiva. For people to see that it's separated, you have to have a Beis Roiva. And then you can taper off. But you cannot taper off within 2 amas. Rabbi Yomer, maschel Beis Roiva. It gave a picture. Again, the quoting Beis Shammai. Okay. Now, Frek the Gemara.
He disagrees with everything we've said.
Well, yeah, yes. What are you talking about? Asks the Gemara that you have to. How can you treat strips and a field the same? So the Gemara answers, no, even Lerebi, it's not the same. Come on, b'meruba. And v'kan b'meishar. The way we'll learn Pshat is that between a field and a field, different ways of reading it, the Beis Roiva has to be complete. Or how much Beis Roiva do you need to have? At least the size of a Beis Roiva. And over here, you have to have in one place Beis Roiva.
Because of the Meishar?
Because they're smaller. But you have to have a Beis Roiva always. The Mishnah says 2 amas. Yeah, you have to have in one place a Beis Roiva, and then you can taper off into the 2 amas. In other words, the Mishnah says 2 amas. The Rabbi Ruba says the 2 amas is about the largest part of the gap. The rest can be smaller. Rebbe says 2 amas is the smallest part of the gap. The biggest part of the gap goes without saying. Now, there's a Havamina here. Rabbi Yeruba cannot argue with Rabbi. Rabbi was an Amoira. So where did he take it from? So see, again, the Yerushalmi takes for granted there was a Braisa in which there was a machlokes between everyone and Rabbi. The Havamina now is that the everyone are even more machmer than Rabbi. Like maybe there's a third opinion. It says the Gemara, the leis lerabanan meishar. In other words, again, based on the Havamina, that there are Tanoim that are even more machmer than Rabbi. What would be more machmer? See, Rabbi is saying Beis Roiva, it can taper off by Mesharim. Between fields, it cannot taper off. If the Chachamim who argued with Rabbi by Mesharim are more machmer, then what would they hold? That even between Mesharim, you have to have the Beis Roiva from one end to the other. But then there'll be a problem because according to those Rambanan, what will be the difference between a Meshar and a field? So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, no, there aren't three opinions. No, the Chachamim that argue with Rabbi is actually the base of Rabbi Chia. That Amar Rabbi Yehuda Soif Meshar LeRabbi Tchilas Meshar LeRabbanan. Soif Meshar LeRabbi. What's Soif Meshar? 2 amas. That the Rabbi is saying the smallest gap you can have between Meshar and Meshar is 2 amas. The Chachamim in the Braisa that we don't even have that argue with Rabbi, they hold no that the 2 amas is the biggest size of the gap. Smallest size of the gap is Kolshu. So now with Chaps, there's only 2 opinions. We don't know we didn't have the Braisa, so we attribute the second opinion to Rabbi Yeruba. Rabbi Yeruba is leaning on the Chacham. So these are the 2 opinions. So now we have it clear. Ben Sada Lo Sada, you have to have a Beis Roiva. Let's go with the Pnei Moshe, the whole thing. Ben Meisha La Meisha Le Rebbe, there always has to be a width of a Beis Roiva. And then you can have less. How much less? Maximum close to Amos. Yeruba says, no. Ben Sada Lo Sada will leave later. Also, Beis Roiva. Between Misharim, you never need to have a Beis Roiva ever. You begin with 2 amas, but not in one place. It has to be at least 2 amas length. That's what he said. It's 2 amas by 2 amas, and then you can taper it off.